In the year 1500, high on the Andes at more than 6,000 meters, the wind screamed like the howl of a demon. An Inca child knelt, knees sinking into frozen stone. It was not night, but a darkness that had settled inside his chest. Each breath escaped his lips in a white plume, vanishing instantly. Every exhale disappeared as quickly as promises the gods had never kept. From the valley below came the drums, heavy, relentless, like hammers nailing a coffin shut. Each strike made his chest tighten, his heartbeat falling in rhythm with death. The wind carried incense and the metallic sweetness of dried blood, a sickly perfume that clung to his throat. He tried to swallow, but it was bitter as ash. The priests emerged, cloaked in crimson feathers. Their eyes were hollow. They did not see a child. They saw an offering. A golden cup of chicha was pressed toward him, thick, sweet as honey. He knew what it meant. Heaviness in the limbs, fog in the mind. A sleep potion, so that the obsidian blade would slip more easily beneath his skin. If it were you, standing at this altitude, with every breath perhaps your last, would you beg for survival or pray for death to come faster? The boy trembled, but he did not resist. He believed this was glory. The Inca called the ritual Capacocha, a sacrifice to please the mountain gods. Die today, live forever in memory tomorrow. So he told himself. But memory does not last. Ironic, isn't it? Only the ice kept them. And archaeology. More than 500 years later, they unearthed 18 children's bodies, perfectly preserved, frozen dolls in the snow. You know that. He didn't. In his mind, death was a hymn of praise. In reality, it was proof of an empire of 10 million souls that secured its throne by cutting the throats of its own children. He was not alone. Tonight, he was just one among hundreds. These rituals stretched across the empire, from Cuzco to the farthest borders. Children between 8 and 16 marched for hundreds of kilometers, only to be sealed in tombs of ice. From the villages below came cheers, approval echoing upward. But on the summit, there was only the drumbeat, the frozen breath, and a small body about to be locked into history. And here lies the most terrifying question. Why would an empire choose to kill its children instead of its enemies? They had chosen him months earlier, in the courtyard of his village where the morning sun turned the dust to gold. His hair was combed with oil, his small hands scrubbed until the skin stung. The priest inspected his teeth, his posture, his skin. Perfect, they said. Perfect meant doomed. His mother wept without sound. She pressed her face into her shawl so her tears would not be heard. His father stood rigid, pretending pride. To bend was weakness. To stand straight was the only rebellion allowed. They called it honor. But honor is only the polite word for helplessness. The messenger from Cusco spoke of glory, of the Sapa Inca's gaze, of a path that climbed into the heavens themselves. The boy listened. He wanted to believe that being chosen was a blessing, not a sentence. That was his flaw, not fear, not cowardice, but faith. Faith that obedience could protect him, faith that the empire's hands were steady. You know better. You know empires have hands like knives. The weeks that followed were a cage disguised as ritual. He was fed the best maize, the fattest llama meat, cups of sweet chicha. At first, he felt special, but each kindness was a chain. The fuller his stomach, the emptier his freedom. Even the coca leaves pressed to his tongue were a leash, keeping him calm. From a distance, the empire looked vast. 10 million people stretched across 4,000 kilometers of mountains and valleys. From his eyes, the empire was a circle of priests who decided whether he breathed tomorrow. What is power, if not the ability to decide who exhales? He thought of his mother's hands, cracked from weaving. She had worked threads until her fingertips bled, believing the gods watched. Now those same gods demanded her son's blood. The empire never asked for her opinion. It only asked for her silence. And what about you? If the state praised your child as chosen, would you clap in front of the neighbors, or would you risk vanishing by saying no? The boy began to feel the trap close. The songs they sang around him were sweet, but sweet like poison. They praised him as a messenger to the gods, yet the gods were absent, and the only faces he saw were men in feathered cloaks who smiled too easily. Every word wrapped tighter. He had no door to escape, fatal flaw and fatal love. He trusted the ritual, and he trusted his people. He thought trust was armor. He was wrong. Trust was the open wound. That night, as he lay under the thatched roof, the drums began in the valley again. The same rhythm, the same verdict. He wondered if the sound would follow him even into sleep. He wondered if gods ever woke up to listen, or if only men did. The cold close whispered itself. The journey was coming, and the road to the mountain would not let him turn back. The journey began at dawn, when the village still smelled of smoke and wet earth. Llamas were loaded with maize and cloth. Attendants moved like shadows. Priests whispered prayers that sounded more like orders than songs. The road tilted upward from the first step, a line of stone carved into the mountainside, each stair pulled from the bones of the Andes. At 3,000 meters, the air thinned. At 4,000, the light turned sharp, the sky almost metallic. By 5,000, each breath cost him a debt he could not repay. He chewed coca leaves to silence the nausea, the bitterness filling his mouth until he forgot the taste of food. The empire had built roads that stretched over 40,000 kilometers, and every stone of them seemed meant to lead him here. He tried to see the beauty. The peaks glittered with snow, condors circled with wings spread wider than men's height. But beauty is another mask for cruelty. A condor does not circle unless it smells something dying. The priests walked steadily, their crimson cloaks flickering in the sun. They did not stumble. They did not sweat. It was as though the gods carried their weight. He wondered if the gods carried his as well, or if the gods were only counting the steps until his knees broke. What about you? How far could you climb with no choice, your lungs tearing, knowing each meter higher was another meter closer to your grave? At night, they camped in stone shelters built for messengers of the empire. He lay awake listening to the wind claw at the walls. The coca numbed his hunger, but not his thoughts. He remembered his mother's loom, the sound of her weaving, the promise that each thread bound them to the gods. Now he wondered, if the gods demanded blood, why had they not demanded hers? Why only his? The priests told him he was blessed, that the empire was at peace because of children like him, that wars were avoided, rains arrived on time, crops grew fat. He tried to believe it. He wanted to believe it. His flaw was belief, and every step of the road pressed harder on it. Dark humor played in his mind. Perhaps he was lucky. Lucky to be perfect enough to die early, before he saw how often the gods failed the people who fed them. The higher they climbed, the more the world emptied. Villages vanished, then farms, then even the scrub grass surrendered. At 5,500 meters, there was only stone, ice, and silence, broken by drums echoing from valleys far below. Drums that sounded like memory, or warning, or verdict. He wondered if the gods slept in these mountains, and if so, whether they dreamed of the children walking upward. The cold close formed as clearly as the road. The higher he climbed, the smaller he became, and soon there would be nothing left of him but breath on frozen air. They taught him how to die politely. That was the first lesson. No tears in front of the priests, no questions after the second cup. Death was ceremony, and ceremony required manners. He learned the smells of preparation: freshly cut hair, maize mash warming over a fire, animal fat rubbed into the skin so the cold would take longer to bite. He learned the objects: spondylus shells the color of arterial blood, tiny silver llamas, belts so finely woven the threads looked whispered rather than spun. Each item placed beside him like punctuation, proof that his life would end in the grammar of ritual. The coca leaves were constant, pressed against his tongue until numbness felt like faith. Chicha followed, sweet and heavy. The more he drank, the less he thought. They called it mercy. Imagine that mercy, designed not to save you, but to keep your hands still while the knife glints above. And if it were you, sitting there with incense in your lungs and numbness in your veins, would you call that kindness, or would you call it the Empire's trick? The boy swallowed it all. He thought swallowing meant obedience, and obedience meant safety. His fatal flaw grew like frost on glass, spreading until nothing else could be seen. He was told he was chosen, so he believed it. He was told he was honored, so he carried the honor like a stone in his chest. The attendants watched him the way farmers watch a harvest. Every gesture measured, every silence counted. If he stumbled, they steadied him. If he coughed, they pressed coca into his mouth. Their hands were gentle, but gentleness is another kind of leash. He began to feel less like a boy, more like a vessel already emptied. Dark humor crept into his thoughts. Maybe he was a gift-wrapped corpse, waiting to be delivered on time. And what does a gift do? It waits. From the outside, this looked magnificent. A child fed, dressed in bright fabrics, adorned with sacred objects. From the inside, it was a cage. No decision was his own. Even the rhythm of his heartbeat seemed chosen for him by the drums that rolled through the valleys. You've seen cages before. Maybe yours had bars of iron. His had bars of silk and song. Which one is harder to break? He lay awake at night listening to the attendants breathe. Their sleep was deep. His was shallow. Each time his eyes closed, he dreamed of snow swallowing him whole. When he woke, he realized the dream was simply rehearsal. The cold close came not in words, but in silence. He understood the ritual was no longer approaching. It had already begun. Neat, he thought. Even his pulse now worked for someone else. The ascent to the high camp devoured days. Each morning began with the same ritual: coca pressed to his tongue, a cup of chicha forced into his hands, prayers muttered in Quechua too low to mean anything. By noon, his legs burned. By nightfall, his breath came in gasps so loud they seemed to belong to someone else. At 5,500 meters, the world no longer pretended to be kind. The air sliced his throat raw, the snow blinded him, his nose bled without warning. He licked the blood from his lip and tasted rust. One more proof that his body was already paying the debt demanded. A girl walked beside him for a time, perhaps 12 years old, her cheeks wind-burned, her lips cracked into thin red lines. She carried a small silver llama in her arms, cradled it the way a mother might cradle an infant. He wanted to ask her name, but naming is dangerous. To name something is to admit you will miss it. And he had been trained for another kind of ending. At night, she whispered songs under her breath. Not to him, not to anyone, just to keep her chest from collapsing. He listened anyway. It reminded him of his mother humming at her loom. The melody was fragile, but sometimes fragile is the only armor. And would you dare whisper on a mountain where the wind devours? Sound? Would you risk the priests hearing your song and deciding it was a sign of rebellion? The road grew steeper. His legs felt like stone. He learned to walk by, not thinking of walking, just left, right, left, until thought itself gave up. The priests never stumbled. Their cloaks billowed red against white, as if even the snow respected their pace. Dark humor clawed at him. Perhaps the gods liked the taste of exhaustion more than blood. Perhaps what they truly wanted was to see a child dragged to the edge of collapse before the knife fell. Archaeologists would one day find children buried not alone, but in pairs, a boy and a girl together, preserved in frozen earth as if companionship mattered in death. That knowledge is yours. For him, it was only the silence between steps, the silver llama gleaming faintly beside him. The higher they climbed, the more the world emptied. Villages gone, then farms, then even the scrub grass surrendered. There was only ice, stone, and the echo of drums below. He felt smaller with every step, as if the mountain were swallowing him alive. He no longer asked when it would end. He only asked how much of himself would remain when it did. The cold close arrived with the wind. The summit was near, and the choice he feared most would soon arrive disguised as destiny. If so, he was a banquet. At dawn, the choice came disguised as weather. A storm broke the line of march. Snow slammed sideways, and the path dissolved into white. For a moment, the rope connecting the children slackened. A guard bent to fix a knot, and space opened like a door no one meant to unlock. The boy saw it. A curve of the path unguarded, the mountain bending away into mist. The wind said, "Run." His body screamed, "Run!" Even his fear whispered, "Run!" But then came the louder voice, the one trained into him since the courtyard, the voice of faith. He remembered the messenger's promise, the priest's chant, his father's stiff pride. To flee would shame them. To flee would shame him. Better to be a body in ice than a rumor in disgrace. And you? If the gods themselves opened a door for you, would you step through it or kneel, grateful, while it closed? He stayed. He closed the door himself. He pulled the rope tight around his wrist and waited for the guard to tie the knot again. That was the moment. Not the knife, not the cup, not the drums. The choice. And once chosen, it could never be unchosen. The storm eased. The path resumed. Step by step, he surrendered the possibility of another life. He felt lighter, not from relief, but from the subtraction of choices. Dark humor stung him. Perhaps freedom had been the heaviest burden all along. The Empire had only done him the kindness of lifting it away. By midday, they climbed past 6,000 meters. The air tore at his lungs like glass. His breath came shallow, and each exhale left his lips slower than the one before. He thought of the children who never reached the summit, who collapsed mid-climb. Archaeologists would later find them too, bones half buried in scree, not enshrined in ritual, but forgotten in transit. Even in death, there was hierarchy. The priests never looked back. They marched as though each step had already been decided centuries before. In a way, it had. Empires are built not on stone, but on repetition, one child after another, one sacrifice after another, until history forgets the names, but remembers the pattern. The girl with the silver llama stumbled. An attendant caught her, steadied her, whispered something sharp. She nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. He looked at her and realized they shared the same prison, a rope that bound not their wrists, but their choices. By nightfall, the summit was a shadow above them. He lay in the shelter, heart hammering against ribs that felt too thin for the weight of breath. The path no longer frightened him. The absence of path did. He had chosen to stay, and staying meant there was only one destination left. The cold close rose with the mountain itself. The next step would not just carry him upward, it would carry him into the place where the gods waited with knives. Freedom, it turned out, had been the heaviest thing he owned. By the 7th day, the road was gone. There was only the mountain, a slope of ice tilted into the sky. Each step no longer felt like travel, but like a negotiation with death. He lifted one foot, placed it down, listened for the verdict. Breath or no breath. At 6,200 meters, the air tasted like iron filings. His chest rattled, each inhale an act of theft. The coca dulled the sickness, but could not stop the black fog at the edges of his sight. The priests said nothing. Their silence was instruction. Pain is part of the ritual, and silence is the only acceptable reply. He wanted to believe silence was strength. That was his flaw, repeating itself, faith disguised as endurance. And if silence were demanded of you, would you give it freely, or would you scream just to prove you still had a throat? The girl with the silver llama still walked beside him. Her lips were blue, her steps broken. But her hands never loosened on the figurine. It gleamed against the snow, ridiculous in its fragility, yet more stubborn than either of them. He thought, maybe the gods admired objects more than people. After all, silver never wept. Dark humor scratched at him. Perhaps the priest should have sacrificed the llama instead. At least it would not complain. By 6,500 meters, the world below vanished. No valleys, no villages, no memory of home-only white horizons and a sky that had lost its color. He felt as though he was already among the dead, walking only because habit had not yet caught up. Archaeologists would one day climb these heights and find children like him, frozen into shrines. The highest, on Lulalaco, at 6,739 meters, still wore their feathered headdresses, their bloodless faces bent in eternal sleep. They would call them the best preserved mummies in the world. A strange honor, to be remembered not as a child, but as a specimen. He did not know that. He only knew the mountain was taking pieces of him. Warmth from his fingers, strength from his legs, hope from his chest, piece by piece, until all that remained was obedience. The priests began chanting louder, their voices carried like stone grinding against stone. The rhythm was endless, and he realized the chant was not for the gods. It was for him, to drown out any thought of escape. And you, listening now, do you hear the chant, too? Does it press against your ribs, insisting there's no other way? That night the wind screamed so hard the shelters shook. He lay curled against the wall, silver threads of the girl's llama catching the faint light. He thought of the door that had once opened in the storm. He thought of how he had closed it. That was the midpoint of his life, the moment he accepted his death. The cold close sharpened as dawn approached. Tomorrow he would not walk as a child climbing. Tomorrow he would walk as an offering delivered. The summit did not welcome them. It devoured them. At nearly 6,700 meters, the mountain was nothing but stone, ice, and silence sharp enough to cut skin. The wind tore at the tents, tore at the cloaks, tore at the body until even thought seemed shredded. Here, the ritual shed its disguise. No more talk of blessing, no more promises of glory, only command. The priests stood taller, their feathered headdresses snapping in the wind, obsidian knives glinting black as spilled oil. The child looked at them and realized he was no longer a boy. He was an object being delivered. The platform was a ring of stones, a hollow cut into frozen ground. Offerings lay waiting, gold figures, shells the color of blood, tufts of hair bound with thread. The girl placed her silver llama beside them, her hands stiff, her lips cracked white. She did not look at him. To look would have meant remembering. To remember would have meant breaking. And you, if you stood before knives with no escape, would you fight Or would you try to vanish into silence, hoping the silence could protect you? The boy tried silence. His breath rattled, mist curling from his lips. He imagined it was his soul leaving early, eager to escape what his body must endure. The priest pressed another cup of chicha to his mouth. He drank because refusal was not allowed. Sweetness filled his throat, cloying, heavy. They said it would keep him calm. Calm, in this case, meant still enough for the blade. Dark humor flickered. Perhaps they wanted his death to be orderly, like writing on a clean page. Even sacrifice required neat handwriting. At this altitude, his body betrayed him. His nose bled. His fingers went numb. His eyes blurred until the priests looked less like men than shadows moving in rhythm. Shadows that hummed, chanted, lifted knives. Archaeologists would later find children exactly like this, seated cross-legged, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Clothing still bright after 5 centuries, hair braided, faces calm. Calm because the chicha and coca had done their work. Calm because there was no other option left. The boy did not know he would be remembered for his posture. He only knew the drums from the valleys below still echoed in his ears, beating like a second heart. The drums did not stop for him. They never had. He wondered if the gods were even watching, or if the only eyes on him belonged to the priests, who looked at him the way carpenters look at wood material, nothing more. The cold close pressed against his chest like the mountain itself. The next breath would carry him to the knife, and the knife would tell him a truth the priests had hidden all along. The knife hovered, obsidian, sharper than steel, black as water that had forgotten how to move. The priests chanted louder, voices grinding against the wind. Each syllable was a wall, closing him in. The boy knelt. His knees burned against frozen stone. He waited for the gods to answer, but the silence was complete. He had given his breath, his hunger, his strength. Now he offered the last thing left, his trust. And nothing answered. He looked at the priests. Their eyes were not turned upward to the heavens. They were locked on him. Hungry, practical, cold. For the first time he understood. The ritual was not for gods, it was for men. Killing enemies makes martyrs. Killing children makes obedience. That was the truth, hiding in every chant, every step, every cup of chicha. The gods had never asked. The empire had demanded. And you, would you accept dying for a lie if everyone around you called it honor? Or would you spit it back, knowing no one would remember the spit? Only the silence. His flaw cracked open inside him. He had believed faith was armor. He had believed obedience would keep him safe. But obedience had only sharpened the blade. Dark humor hissed in his mind. Perhaps the gods were watching after all, laughing at how easy it was to trick mortals into feeding them children they never asked for. The girl placed her silver llama on the stone beside him. Her lips trembled, but her eyes did not rise. She knew too. She knew the gods were absent. The llama gleamed brighter than either of them would ever be allowed to. Archaeologists would later photograph children like this, cross-legged, serene, braided hair, perfect after 5 centuries. They would call it ritual beauty. They would not call it what it was, power feeding on innocence. 18 mummies recovered, each one proof that the empire's control was worth more than its children. The priest raised the knife higher. The boy closed his eyes, not to pray, but to stop seeing the lie written on every face around him. His breath rose white into the air. He thought, "This is the last thing that belongs to me. And what about you? When the last thing that belongs to you is taken, do you surrender it? Or do you curse the hands that take it?" The knife descended. The wind screamed louder. The drums from the valley below did not pause. The cold close bled through the silence. What died here was not just a child, but the illusion that gods demand blood. What lived was the Empire's hunger, waiting to consume the next. The blade cut, but the mountain kept him. Snow sealed the wound, ice closed the mouth, wind erased the scream. He was no longer a boy. He was arrangement arms, folded, head bowed, body set like an object in a shrine. For the priests, it was done. They returned down the slope, leaving him to the gods. But the gods never came. Only the cold. Only silence. And silence is loyal. It stayed for centuries. His body froze where it was placed. Skin tightened like leather, hair held its braid, teeth clenched. He became proof that obedience does not vanish, it calcifies. When archaeologists found him 500 years later, they called him the best preserved child mummy in the world. They measured his height, his bones, the coca in his stomach. Numbers where once there had been a name. And would you want to be remembered as evidence? Would you want strangers to praise the perfection of your corpse? The empire continued for only a breath of history after his death. By 1533, the Spanish arrived. Steel, horses, plague. The Inca, who had traded children for stability, collapsed in less than a generation. 10 million people folded into silence. Gods did not protect them. Sacrifice did not save them. The empire had believed loyalty bought time. Time proved otherwise. Dark humor lingers here. They gave their children to the mountains, but lost their empire to men who cared nothing for the mountains. The boy's flaw had been faith. He believed obedience was armor, but his death proved obedience was only currency spent cheaply, without return. You sit here, centuries later, safe, breathing air thick enough to fill your chest. Yet the question waits for you, colder than Andes' wind. What gods are you feeding? What knives do you polish with your silence? The silver llama rests in a museum now, behind glass. Visitors press faces to it, whisper about its beauty. They rarely speak of the girl who held it. Beauty is safer than truth. The truth is this: power never asked the gods. Power only asked the people, and the people obeyed. The boy would like me to tell you he was brave. Listen, the breath that vanished on the first page is still fading into cold air, and the drums from the valley never stopped. They only learned new hands. He was. But bravery was irrelevant. Cost was everything. His death bought nothing but another. Entry in the Empire's ledger of fear. Thematic punchline. The price of blind faith is not glory, not memory, not peace. It is silence that lasts longer than history.